Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast. Let's get week 40 of today's Tolkien Times underway with Mailbag Monday. Now, Miriam E. points out something that Gandalf says in The Quest of Erebor. That's sort of the synopsis of The Hobbit that we read about in Unfinished Tales. It's a great story if you've never read it before. Gandalf says, "I knew in my heart that Bilbo must go with him," Thorin, that is, "or the whole quest would be a failure. And suddenly I felt that I was indeed in hot earnest. This queer notion of mine was not a joke. It was right." With that in mind, Miriam asks, once he is in Middle-earth and no longer living the life of Olorin and Valinor, do you suppose Gandalf can still receive any type of direct communication from the Valar or Eru? Or is what he is describing here just an intuition, a hunch, a gut feeling? How is Gandalf guided in knowing how to do what is right? He doesn't always seem sure, so how do you suppose this works? All right, good question. Well, first, let's look at the moment that Miriam includes in her question and see if we can find anything further. In The Quest of Erebor, Frodo is documenting the story that Gandalf is telling to him, Pippin, Merry, and Gimli in the house in Minas Tirith after Elisar's coronation. There are a few points in the tale where Gandalf speaks of this intuition, hunch, or foresight. And the first is when we read, "Somehow I had been attracted by Bilbo long before, as a child and a young hobbit. He had not quite come of age when I had last seen him. He had stayed in my mind ever since, with his eagerness and his bright eyes and his love of tales, and his questions about the wide world outside the Shire. As soon as I entered the Shire, I heard news of him. He was getting talked about, it seemed. Both his parents had died early for Shire folk, at about 80, and he had never married. He was already growing a bit queer, they said, and went off for days by himself. He could be seen talking to strangers, even dwarves. Even dwarves. Suddenly in my mind these three things came together. The great dragon with his lust, and his keen hearing and scent. The sturdy, heavy-booted dwarves and their old burning grudge. And the quick, soft-footed hobbit, sick at heart, I guessed, for a sight of the wide world." Well, there it seems like Gandalf is first drawn to Bilbo. Now, that could be, from an outside influence, perhaps, but it's also just a personal connection. I mean, after all, he loved stories and had questions about the world outside the Shire, which was rather unique among hobbits. But the second part of that is just Gandalf putting two and two together, so to speak. And when he goes to look for Bilbo, he finds that the hobbit is out and about. His neighbors speak of him going off for days, talking to dwarves, looking for elves at their new year, and that evidence of Bilbo's Tookish side convinces Gandalf. Better and better, I thought. I think I shall risk it. Well, shortly after that, Gandalf is arguing with Thorin about including Bilbo, and the haughty dwarf is opposed to the idea, saying that Bilbo is soft, and suspecting that Gandalf has other purposes than helping Thorin. Gandalf's response here is telling. "If I had no other purposes, I should not be helping you at all. Great as your affairs may seem to you, they are only a small strand in the great web. I am concerned with many strands. But this should make my advice more weighty, not less. I spoke at last with great heat. 'Listen to me, Thorin Oakenshield,' I said. 'If this hobbit goes with you, you will succeed. If not, you will fail. A foresight is on me, and I am warning you.'" Now there we have it. Now we see that there's something more going on than just a hunch. But foresight, it's honestly something we often see in Middle-earth. It's certainly not specific to Gandalf. Too many examples to name, really. And there's no evidence to suggest that this means Gandalf is getting that foresight from any external source, like the Valar or even Eru. In fact, if we go to the letters and look at letter number 156, that's a draft to Robert Murray written in 1954, Tolkien explains that in any case, none of my angelic persons are represented as knowing the future completely, or indeed at all where other wills are concerned, hence their constant temptation to do or try to do what is for them wrong and disastrous, to force lesser wills by power, by awe, if not by actual fear or physical constraint. And that point that he makes about how it's both wrong and disastrous to force others brings me back to the Quest of Erebor. Now, it's from an earlier manuscript, but it tells us a bit more about how Gandalf reached his conclusions. It starts the same. It's after the coronation. The companions are staying in a house in Minas Tirith. They're peppering Gandalf with questions. Frodo writes about Gimli telling Pippin that he wants to go visit the Shire. "No dwarf of the house of Durin could fail to look with wonder on that land. Did not the recovery of the kingship under the mountain and the fall of Smaug begin there? Not to mention the end of Barad-dûr, though both were strangely woven together. Strangely, very strangely, he said and paused. He goes on to ask if Gandalf planned it all this way, and Gandalf doesn't answer. In fact, he's quiet for quite a bit. And then the text goes on. But at last he turned to Gimli and said, I do not know the answer, for I have changed since those days, and I am no longer trammeled by the burden of Middle-earth as I was then. In those days I should have answered you with words like those I used to Frodo, only last year in the spring. Only last year. But such measures are meaningless. In that far distant time I said to a small and frightened hobbit, Bilbo was meant to find the ring, and not by its maker, and you, therefore, were meant to bear it. And I might have added, and I was meant to guide you both to those points. To do that, I used in my waking mind only such means as were allowed to me, doing what lay to my hand, according to such reasons as I had. But what I knew in my heart, or knew before I stepped on these grey shores, that is another matter. Olorin I was in the west that is forgotten, and only to those who are there shall I speak more openly. Okay, we get a bit more here, but unfortunately it's still not super clear. There seems to be a mix here of old knowledge that he retained after coming to Middle-earth, and the means as were allowed to him, using reason and his inherent wisdom. Still, the essay on the Astari says, being embodied, the Astari had need to learn much anew by slow experience. And though they knew whence they came, the memory of the blessed realm was to them a vision from afar off, for which, so long as they remained true to their mission, they yearned exceedingly. Now that suggests, honestly, a relatively limited amount of pre-Middle-earth knowledge. Still, Gandalf's statement at the end of that preceding paragraph suggests he had at least a tiny bit, maybe a few snippets of useful knowledge before he came to Middle-earth. Now, what that knowledge is, how it fits with the quest of Erebor and the eventual quest to destroy the ring, we simply don't know. But to speak to your question more directly, Miriam, it does not appear that there was any sort of live connection between Gandalf and the Valar, let alone Eru. Now, I do imagine, and this is just headcanon, but I think that Eru had a few things to tell Gandalf when he was sent back as Gandalf the White. That's certainly the implication to me in letter number 156, when Tolkien writes that Gandalf was sent by a mere prudent plan of the angelic Valar or governors, but authority, and here he's clearly talking about Eru, had taken up this plan and enlarged it at the moment of its failure. Naked I was sent back for a brief time until my task is done. Sent back by whom, and whence? Not by the gods, whose business is only with this embodied world and its time, for he, that's Gandalf, passed out of thought and time. Now, even after Gandalf's return, there's nothing to suggest any sort of real-time connection for insight from Valinor, let alone the timeless halls. Instead, I think what we have is a combination of more than 2,000 years of wisdom gained in Middle-earth, plus maybe a tiny bit of knowledge retained from his time as Olorin in Valinor. Well, folks, that wraps it up for Mailbag Monday. If you have a question that you'd like me to answer, please email it to barnum@theprancingponypodcast.com. Let him know it's for today's Tolkien Times, and I'll get to it as soon as possible, with priority going to supporters of the show on Patreon. Now, if you'd like to help me keep making this show better, please visit patreon.com/Tolkien Times to find out how you can get Mailbag priority, how you can join the TTT Content Council, get a bonus episode every week, and a lot more. And join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times for Tolkien Tuesday as we learn more about the professor himself. If you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe, follow or subscribe in your podcast apps, and follow @Tolkien Times on social media. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.